So now we're going to talk about when and why to worry about the reliability and validity of a study. There are very common problems that crop up in studies that we could try to prevent or try to mitigate in some way when we design our studies for this class. And that's what we're going to talk about now. There are many types of protecting reliability. One of them is making sure you get your questions right. If your measure is a survey, the reliability depends on how much thought you put into the wording of each item to make sure that they are similar to each other. One way that reliability is improved in terms of getting the questions right is if you give people more questions. This is why in psychology studies, you may take a whole lot of questionnaires and they might be kind of long because the reliability of most measures is going to increase as we increase the number of questions. Or if it's an observational study, remember we talked about inter-rater reliability. The more raters we have, the more consistent we're going to be overall. We're going to get a nice average between all of those. But why is this the case? We also have some threats to validity. Some relate to who we choose to be in our study in the first place. This is called a selection bias when we sample people who don't represent our overall population very well. A big notable historical example was polling for the 1936 election using phone directories and car registrations. So people who were asking folks who they wanted to vote for were calling people from phone books. They were accessing people's addresses from their car registrations and calling those phone numbers. And the newspapers, because of these polls, predicted that Alf Landon would win. They actually printed incorrect election results because they were so confident based on these polls. But actually, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, won the 1936 presidential election. So they were asking the wrong people in the polling process. You can imagine that in 1936, if you don't know much about what types of infrastructure we had in the United States, telephones were not ubiquitous. Not everybody had them. I know where I come from in the southern Appalachian area in northeast Alabama, that was before the Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the New Deal programs, started bringing electricity to the area that I'm from. And so you can imagine without electricity, they didn't have phone lines either. And this was probably the case for many remote areas in the United States. Back then, way fewer people lived in cities. So now a much higher proportion of our population lives in cities compared to living in rural areas. Most people were farmers at this time in the United States, but we did have a lot of factory workers in cities. And these poor farmers, many of them, may also not have had cars. So phone numbers and car registrations left a lot of people out, and that's why the polling results were so far off from the actual voting results of the election. Imagine in this sampling example that I have 40 Intro to Psych students who want to participate in research this semester. Let me know if you're looking for participants. We call this convenience sampling, okay? And this is what we do a lot in psychology. We don't go out and find people in some kind of database and randomly choose people from populations who represent all of the United States, which is what people try to do when they poll for presidential elections. They try to find samples that are representative of all the registered voters. Now, in psychology, we tend to use this convenience sample of who we have just laying around who would like to participate in research. And that's often our introduction to psychology students or students in our other psychology courses. These students tend to not be representative of other young adults ages 18 to 24-ish because most of them are white women. Psychology majors are primarily female. About 75% of most psychology samples, or sometimes more depending on the school, tend to be women. Because only around a quarter or sometimes less of our samples are men, it can make it very difficult to know if the findings that we find in our samples generalize or have external validity to any other people of this age group. And plus, the fact that these are college students instead of people in the military or other occupations or in the same age group, because college students are still only a minority slice of people in y'all's age group, is another threat to our external validity. We have other issues with who we pick that could crop up, like the non-response bias. Meaning that people who choose to do a survey in the first place are already different from people who don't do surveys. So just like in that presidential polling, when they weren't hearing from people who didn't have phones, In our non-response bias, we're not hearing from the regular average Joes who may just not respond to surveys. There's a lot of surveys that hit my inboxes after I shop anywhere about customer satisfaction that I pretty much never take, so my opinions are not counted in their research. Mail surveys are especially prone to this. They used to send out mail-in questionnaires that you would have to mail back, and only like single-digit percentages of those come back. Online studies too, because our email inboxes are just inundated with junk like this nowadays, also can have fairly low response rates.